Morning. Had a question from a user on TikTok asking how the heck did Mike and I ever end up in New Orleans? So that's what today's video is going to be all about. These, by the way, are glasses from Crew. I get asked about these frames all the time. It's Krewe. I shop at the one on Royal. And yeah, they're fantastic. Oops, still not clean. So I think to understand in fullness how Mike and I got here requires more storytelling than what I'm going to include here. You should check out the video about our son's passing. That was a big catalyst for change in our lives, and how we think about the time that we have here together. So this story is actually kind of insane. Mike and I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and we lived in a house that was really, really big, like way too big for us. But at the time, we were living just outside of Boston. In fact, that's another great story. I'll have to tell you guys how that house came to be, because these are dominoes. I think this is how life works. We don't necessarily understand how the dominoes fall and what this one experience can ultimately lead to, because we wouldn't have had the house in Providence if we hadn't had the house in Quincy, Massachusetts. And we wouldn't have had that house without the most wonderful formal boss wanting us to get into a great home. But that's another story for another time. So we lived in this, the house was actually 8 bedrooms. We almost never even went to the 3rd floor. So let me explain the layout of the house. So it was built in 1885. It was an old Victorian with a mansard roof, and it was a corner lot. And it was actually really interesting because when we bought the house, the front door was on one street, and it was a beautiful, beautiful porch with big pillars, and I'll drop a picture in here. But it was a stunning home. And on the other street, because we were on a corner, you could actually come into the basement level of the home, and it was a former doctor's office. And it looked like a serial killer's domain when we bought the house. It was like literally there were 3 exam rooms with sinks in them. There were 2 big safes where he must have kept his pharmaceuticals. I mean, there was like a glass window where the nurse's station was. It was crazy. So you had that on the ground floor, and then you had the house proper. The first floor had this really nice big kitchen with a little sunroom, and a butler's pantry, and a formal dining room, and what was probably the ballroom. It was a huge room. It was probably 60 feet long, and well, maybe not 60. Maybe it was maybe 30 or 40 feet long, easily. And then it had a library, and in the library it had built-in bookshelves, bookcases, because the former owner was an antique book dealer. And then the second floor had a big laundry room, which was over the kitchen in the back of the house, and then a bathroom, 2 bedrooms, and then on one side, and then on the other side of the hallway were 2 more bedrooms and another bathroom. And then on the 3rd floor, there were 4 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen. And when we got into the house, that kitchen was actually, like, it still had its appliances. So it was crazy to buy this house, except that it was only 15 minutes from where I worked. And that was the kind of the driver for us moving, was I just had too long a commute. And so we moved down to this house, which we got for an incredibly low price, like crazy low. It was on Providence East Side, over by Brown University. And it was such a beautiful old home. It had a 4-car garage. It had a beautiful victory garden. And when we moved in, we put in a pool. And so and my mom moved with us. My mom has pretty much almost always lived with me my entire life, with the exception of college, 2 years in Alameda, California, and a year in London. She's lived with me my entire life. So she moved with us, and she got the second floor. Mike and I took the third floor. The first floor was shared. The ground floor was the crazy doctor's office. My mom was starting to show signs of being unstable on her feet. And so after a year, we actually had the entire ground floor gutted. The ground floor, where the serial killer lair was. And we had a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment put in there for her. And that's where she moved in. So, we've got this massive house. Now Mike and I aren't on the third floor. We're on the second floor. We're not even using the third floor except for when the kids come. But of course, I bought furniture for all this, right? So I have one of the 8 bedrooms was Mike's office. Everything else had a bedroom set in it. It's crazy how much furniture we had in that house for 2 people. But we had great parties. People could come spend, the evening for dinner and just spend the night because the third floor is free. And we were there for, I guess it would have been 3 years, and a catalyst of events happened. So I guess I told you about the house and how special it was because this is one of the important pieces of how this all comes together. So Ryan, our son, passes in December of 2022. And, we had the condo down here for 4 years at that time. And our lives were just, destroyed. I'm not ready to cry this morning, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but I knew I would never, ever be the same person again. And so he died on December 2nd, and we just got through December. We had originally planned to come down to New Orleans to the condo I was going to work remote, and we were going to spend as much of Mardi Gras here as we could. And we thought, we're not going to go down there. This doesn't make any sense. There's no joy in our lives. Nor am I looking for any. But the more we thought about climate, we actually thought it actually would be really good for us to be in New Orleans because you walk here, especially if you live in the French Quarter, you just walk a lot. And I thought that would be really healthy. Being kind of stuck in the house, not going anywhere during the coldest, darkest days of the year would be tough. So we came down. And now at this point, I loved New Orleans and Michael liked New Orleans. I definitely had it in my head that this is where I wanted us to be long term. And Michael was like, well, I don't know. I'm concerned about the heat. New England feels very comfortable to him as an English person. And he just wasn't fully sure. And then we had this very prolonged stay here. I think we were down here for almost 2 months in the condo, thanks to a very, very kind boss and leadership team at my company. And Michael, a light went off for him. He was suddenly like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I think the things that were a catalyst for Mike were that it felt like a neighborhood, like a really, maybe it harkened back to something that he had felt when he was growing up. Pub culture is huge in England, of course, or it used to be. I don't think it is as much anymore. But, you walk to your local bar, they know you, they have treats for the dogs, and he just met lots and lots of people, and he's very, very social. You can see him. I think he's going to bring me a coffee soon. And he started looking at property, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. He's there. And we started to talk about it, and we were like, okay, in a couple of years, let's think about possibly moving down here. It was more of a retirement thing in our heads at that time than it was a pre-retirement, or 62, let's just call it. And then, as most things in our lives, we were sitting around drinking on a Friday night, and I swear, this was a Saturday night, It always happens this way. There's always like, we've had a couple of drinks, someone gets an idea, I'm usually the one with the idea, and then things start to roll. And so at that time, I was working in a role at my company that was very easily made into a remote role. Hold on, my coffee's coming. Thank you, baby. I love you.
Very well.
So yeah, I was working a role where working remote was very viable, but I would of course need to be back in the office more than never. And I was also aware that the company was going to be doing some very serious cost control efforts. And so I was starting to get a little concerned about, well, we have this big, beautiful house and we can afford this mortgage. It's not any kind of a hassle for us. But if in 2 years the company decides that they're going to downsize and I don't have a job, then we're in for a lot of change very, very quickly. So all this stuff was kind of kicking around in our heads, and I said to Michael, if my boss would let me work remote, would you be willing to consider a move to New Orleans? And he said, I don't know, this is really fast. We just talked about, I just got my head around the idea of like moving to New Orleans later. Now you're talking about it now. And I said, that's fair. So I'll tell you, like, we have this thing that we have figured out about our relationship. I like change with a little stability. He likes stability with a little bit of change. And I tend to move very quickly. When things start to flow, I move quickly. And that can be very unsettling for Michael because he's not a big fan of change. And he was right. This was coming up very, very fast. And I said, okay, like, let's pump the brakes. Let's first do this. Let me ask my boss if I can even work remote. So that Saturday night, I sent him a slightly drunken text and said, would you let me work remote? And he said, let's talk about it on Monday. Went into the office, we talked, and he was okay with that. And I said, okay, great, because that opens up New Orleans for us. And I'm not sure he realized I was talking about remote, right? I think he just thought work from home in like 15 minutes from the office. And so we kind of talked about it, and I proposed, if this were to happen, I would come back up to the office once a month, spend, 4 or 5 days. I would do that on my own dime. And we would do it that way. So that was kind of how I went back to Michael with like, okay, we could make this work if we wanted to. And again, we talked about it a little bit, and we basically said like we should look at this through a financial lens first before we do anything. We knew not the stock market, the housing market was really hot in Providence, Rhode Island at the time. And we knew that, like, especially kind of with COVID and people working from home, going into the office only a couple of days a week, what we thought we were seeing, and I think this is true, is that people who had chosen originally to trying to live in Boston or in New York was cutting the difference, and they were living in Providence, and they were just taking the train on the days they had to go in the office. And so there was very little inventory on the market. In fact, there was a house down, like 3 blocks down from us. This is the only house in our area that had been on the market, and it sold very, very quickly for $1.6 million. It was, so we knew there was the potential of us being in a good place if we could get a real estate agent we trusted to come in and let us know what they thought. So I call a friend. She's a real estate agent. And I say, look, can you come by? We're thinking we might want to sell the house. We're not sure, but we'd like to get some sense of what the property might be worth. And we didn't have that big a mortgage on it. All things considered, right? Like, you guys can just look this up on Google, I know, but like, we didn't have a large mortgage on the house. And so we knew if we could sell it for a good amount, then we would have a nice profit. And so so she came by on the Friday. Michael was leaving, I think, on the Sunday to go to England for a couple, like maybe like 4 or 5 days or something. Maybe it was even 10 days, I forget. It was 10 days. And she told us that our house was worth 3 times what we had paid for it. And we were like, okay. And Michael was like, oh, we should definitely sell the house. Because these opportunities, it's a once in a lifetime thing, right? I mean, the dominoes just fell for us in a really great way. We got really, really lucky. I like to think that Ryan had a hand in all this. But now here's where the story gets crazy. Because the fact that had this amazing house and, it was worth all this money and we were going to make a huge profit on it. We had put a lot of money into it, like with the pool and the apartment, so we actually spent a lot of money to get to this place. But Mike went to England, and I just called our painter because I think this was in this was like the end of March or something. And I called our painter and I said, hey, can you come by the house? We want to get some painting projects on the books because we're probably going to list the house in July. So he came by, we kind of talked through the projects that we thought needed to be done. And I said to him, like, look, this is what our agent has told us to list for. I know that you buy properties and then, you do your thing. Do you have any interest in buying it? And it was kind of out of his range, so he wasn't interested. But Mike comes home on the next Thursday. We're just thinking, okay, July's months off. We can figure this out. We have a nice timeline to work with. And that Friday, he came on Thursday. That Friday, our neighbor walks across the street. I mean, we're like 10 days into, like, conceptually, at this point it would have been 14 days, into Michael and I at least being on the same page that we're going to sell the house. And our neighbor walks across the street and he says, your painter is my painter. And he just told me that you're selling the house. And he told me how much you want to sell it for. And I have a buyer for you. And we were like, well, what do you mean you have a buyer for us? Like, sure, of course you do, right? Like, everybody's neighbor knows somebody who wants their house, maybe. But he said, no, this is an extremely wealthy family. And they just bought the house down the street for their daughter. They paid cash. And the wife wants a house in the neighborhood to be close to her grandchildren. And they saw your house online from its previous listing, and they want your house. They had already called me and said, how do we get that house? And I told them, people live in it, you can't get it. These are words that you dream of, but you never hear, but we heard them. And so we said, oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, he said, well, no, they're coming tomorrow. And I said, well, the house isn't staged. We've done nothing. We don't. And he said, no, you don't understand. They want your house. They're coming in tomorrow to look at property. I said, okay, well, 1 o'clock? Sure, okay. So I had to do two things. I had to, one, call my real estate agent and say, please sign paperwork with me right now, and can you come tomorrow, because I think we have a buyer for the house. And I know, like, a lot of people would say, like, you should never have even, like, used your agent because this all came to you through another pathway, but, well, that didn't feel very ethical to me. And we couldn't have managed this transaction without her, so yeah, that was absolutely the right thing to do. But then I had to talk to my mom, and I had to say, look, because we had already told her, this is what we're thinking of, this is why. She understood the drivers, and, I asked her to come with us, because she's always lived with us, and she has that need to stay close. So, oh, we got some dogs coming out. So I asked her if could she please just, like, tidy up the house, not cook any fish, and hi Riley, and go for a drive at 1 o'clock the next day. So that's what happens. This what ends up being an absolutely lovely couple come to the home. They spend like 2 or 3 hours there, and they fall in love with the property. And before this, our agent has said, like, what's your absolute dream situation? Now, we had already booked flights for 10 days from that Saturday to go to New Orleans and just start looking around for property. because we knew we could go and live in the condo, but with the dogs, we knew we wanted to buy a house. We knew eventually we'd be selling the house. We didn't think it would be this fast, but so that was in 10 days. So I told her, I said, okay, my ideal scenario is this is our asking price. It's a cash deal. No inspection, no friction at all to like getting the deal done. And they settle in on the Wednesday before we leave Thursday morning. And they let us stay in the house until, let's call it like June 18th, maybe, something like that, so we have time to actually pack. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, it was insane. Like, that never happens. Like, I mean, even our real estate agent, she's like, okay, so first of all, you've just set a price point for the neighborhood. Second of all, like, this doesn't happen. But it happened. And it's, Mike and I really do believe that when stuff starts to flow like that, it was meant to be. Sorry if the camera's wiggling, Riley's wanting a little attention. And so, I mean, so we now have a deal. We close on the house. And just before this happens, my mother says, I don't want to move with you. I'm like, okay. She's like, I want to move back to Norwood, which is where my brother lives and where we spent a lot of our time growing up. That's where I want to live. I'm like, okay. So now Mike and I have to downsize a 4-car garage with an 8-bedroom house and get ourselves ready to move to a house that we haven't even identified in New Orleans. We have to get my mother into a new apartment. We have to find an apartment, move her to the apartment, to get her settled in. And we need to do this all before like June 18th. I mean, it was so end to end, this whole thing was like 45 days. I don't do this. I mean, the outcome's wonderful, but like if you can avoid doing something in that like this big in that compressed timeline, yeah, don't do it. So I have a picture of Mike and I'll put in here. We flew down to New Orleans on the Thursday morning. We looked like shell-shocked. But we had been looking online at properties for a while. But the big shift was that my mom didn't need to live with us. Now, we had expected we would try to buy a house with a back building so that my mom could have her own separate residence. And that kind of changed. That wasn't as important to us anymore. But we knew we wanted a separate space anyway, just, we were both going to be working remotely from work. So, yeah, we came down here on the Thursday. We saw properties Thursday and Friday. And when we saw this property, we just knew. We don't like the front of the property because it faces onto the back of the TV station. But the thing is, in New Orleans, your front door is a lot like your back door, and your back area is like your front yard, if that makes sense. The courtyard was what was really important to us, the space, the places for the dogs, the privacy of the courtyard. That's really important. We have a almost completely private courtyard, which is actually kind of rare. So we made the offer on the house on the Friday, and it was accepted, and that was a cash deal. And luckily, there was nobody here in the house, so it wasn't like they had to move out. They had some things they had to do. We did do the inspections and all that kind of good stuff. When you buy a property in the French Quarter, you also want to do a Freedom of Information Act request from the Vieux Carré Commission to make sure that there's no liens against your property from the VCC. And there weren't. The property was in good form. And so, so we went back home. We knew we were moving into this house, which has 2 bedrooms, and we knew we had to downsize from 8 bedrooms. And like, if you had known me at that time, you would have all my furniture. I couldn't get rid of our furniture fast enough. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how stressful that time was. Michael was he was a machine. He was awesome. And so all of this is happening really, really fast. And the irony is we'd always said, look, if we're moving to New Orleans, let's just not move when we're going into the summer, because that's kind of like the hardest time of year to live here. Yeah, we moved in, I think, on June 23rd. And then we immediately in July had the 10 hottest days of the year. I think New Orleans was the second hottest city in the world for those 10 days. But yeah, like that's how fast it happened. It, we had a lot of, I'm glad we had those like 5 years of being here off and on to really experience all the seasons, all the nuances and idiosyncratic things that happened in the French Quarter. So we really understood what it was that we were moving to. It is different as a full-timer than just part-time, but yeah, I mean, we are so happy here. Now, just to kind of tie this story out a little bit further, so we moved here in the June, and I was still in my role. I was doing that remote role, and the company offered anyone over the age of 55 with at least 10 years experience at the company an option of early retirement at the end of 23. And I raised my hand and took that deal. And I really miss working at that company, and I really love working. But especially with the death of our son, the amount of change we were absorbing in our personal lives, it was such a gift to get a year of just taking a break. And so that was 2024, and now we're in the beginning of 25. I like working, so I'm thinking about work again. I do have some health things that I'm working with, which I'll share like in another video thing. But yeah, that's a long video. It's 26 minutes. I'm gonna have to cut it down. But yeah, that's how Michael and I ended up in New Orleans. And I'll say this about like why this works for us. I'm a pretty extreme introvert, and Mike's an extrovert. And this is the perfect balance for us, because as an introvert, I can, the pace is a little bit slower here. So I also have anxiety. So the pace here is a little bit slower. And the relationships are they're not, in my opinion, superficial. It's a very caring neighborhood, and I really love that as an introvert. And Mike loves it as an extrovert, because he can be out there walking every night with Riley, having his, chats with all the neighbors, and that really lifts him up. There's a big expat community here, a lot of English people, and so he can go to the pub with his mates and watch the soccer. Yeah, it really worked out for us. Now I just need this health thing not to be a thing, and then yeah, we'll see what's to come. But I'm glad you asked the question, because it's a pretty crazy story. And yeah, let me know if you have any other questions about life in New Orleans, and I'll do more long form content on that. Oh, have you liked and subscribed? You should like and subscribe, please. Thank you.